White judge finds black woman only to learn she's the head of the bar association. At 9:07 a.m., the heavy doors of courtroom 3A swung open. All heads turned as Naomi Washington entered, her heels echoing sharply on the marble floor. The room froze. She wasn't just late, she was walking into a storm. Judge Victor Langston, known for his harsh discipline, looked up with a piercing glare. He didn't need a clock. She was 7 minutes late, and everyone knew it. Naomi's navy suit was flawless, her white blouse pristine. She moved with quiet composure, though a bead of sweat slid down her jaw, evidence not of fear, but of the rush to help a desperate single mother avoid eviction just minutes earlier. She had just prevented one injustice. Now she was about to face another. "Miss Washington," Judge Langston barked, rising slightly from his bench. His voice boomed across the courtroom, silencing the soft murmurs and rustling papers. "You are late. 7 minutes late, to be exact. Do you believe this courtroom operates on your schedule?" Naomi opened her mouth, calm and professional, but the judge's gavel struck hard, once, twice, before she could utter a word. "This is not a forum for your excuses," he snapped. "Do you think you're exempt from the rules because of your reputation?" A hush fell, the kind of hush that signaled everyone knew what was coming, but no one dared to interfere. Naomi straightened her back. Her voice, when it came, was measured, respectful. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was assisting a client in an emergency eviction situation. A single mother." "I did not ask for a story," the judge snapped again, eyes narrowed. "You are in contempt of court for your blatant disregard of procedure. I'm fining you $1,000, effective immediately. This courtroom is not a place for late arrivals and self-righteous monologues." The silence that followed was oppressive. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the sound of fingers typing from the court reporter's station. Naomi stood still, absorbing the blow. Her breath remained steady, but her eyes shifted subtly to the left, where her client, a nervous man named Samuel Ortega, sat frozen in disbelief. 7 minutes. 7 minutes of delay after years of service. After hundreds of pro bono cases. After turning down high-paying corporate offers to fight for people who couldn't afford representation. After graduating top of her class from Harvard Law. After building her own legal clinic from scratch in a neglected part of the city. 7 minutes. And she was being publicly humiliated by a man who hadn't even asked why. But Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She walked quietly to her seat at the defense table, unfolded her notes with precise movements, and sat beside her client with the elegance of a queen forced to sit among thieves. The opposing counsel, 3 smug men in $1,000 suits, exchanged satisfied smirks. They knew Judge Langston. He liked order. He liked control. And he did not like being challenged, especially by someone like Naomi. Someone black, someone brilliant, someone who had already, in their eyes, climbed too far. Langston's face remained stony as he leaned forward, gavel still in hand, fingers tapping the wood like a ticking bomb. "Let this serve as a reminder to every person in this courtroom," he said coldly. "Punctuality is not optional. Discipline is not negotiable." Naomi glanced up, her eyes unreadable. She had seen injustice wear many masks. Sometimes it came as brute force. Other times it came dressed in a black robe with a nameplate and a gavel. The gallery watched in stiff silence. Law students scribbled notes furiously, unsure if they were witnessing a lesson in law or in cruelty. The older attorneys looked away. No one intervened. No one objected. Because in that courtroom, power didn't belong to the truth. It belonged to the man with the microphone. Naomi exhaled slowly, not in surrender, but in steel-like restraint. She placed a single page from her folder onto the table. The page contained timestamps, emails, and signed legal documents proving that while this courtroom waited in icy silence, she had saved a woman and her child from becoming homeless. But she didn't speak of it, not yet, because Naomi Washington knew battles weren't won by screaming back. They were won by standing tall, by building truth brick by brick, and by surviving long enough to show everyone who underestimated you just how wrong they were. The room's atmosphere remained taut, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. Judge Langston moved on to call the case. Ortega versus Cortec Industries, he said without emotion. Miss Washington, are you prepared to proceed despite your morning difficulties? Naomi stood, her hands resting gently on the desk. I am, Your Honor. Her voice was calm, controlled, but beneath that surface lay a quiet fury. Controlled not by weakness, but by discipline forged through years of navigating courtrooms that treated her like a guest in a house she helped build. The gavel struck again, and the trial began. Fan high. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly overhead as the case Ortega versus Cortec Industries officially commenced. Naomi Washington adjusted her blazer and gave a brief, steady nod to her client, Samuel Ortega, a middle-aged man with rough, calloused hands and weary eyes. He was the owner of a small electronics repair shop, modest, family-run, and now teetering on the edge of collapse thanks to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit claiming patent infringement. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table gleamed. 3 high-powered attorneys from Cortec sat confidently, draped in sleek charcoal suits, their expressions as smooth as their rehearsed statements. The lead counsel, Jonathan Maddox, stood and addressed the court with the swagger of someone who knew the terrain favored him. He launched into a long-winded narrative about Cortec's pioneering intellectual property, weaving in complex jargon with deliberate authority. For nearly 20 uninterrupted minutes, he paced, gestured, postured, painting Ortega as a back-alley tinkerer infringing on the sacred domain of corporate innovation. He was never interrupted, not once. Judge Victor Langston, seated high on the bench, listened without reaction, his hands folded calmly. He didn't flinch when Maddox veered into speculation. He didn't object when Maddox subtly insulted Ortega's lack of education or Naomi's emotional tone. He simply let the show play out. When Maddox finally said, "We rest our opening with confidence in our evidence and the strength of our claim," the judge gave a curt nod. Naomi rose slowly. She moved with measured precision, the weight of her silence all morning fueling her calm fire. She placed her hand on a stack of documents and addressed the court with unwavering clarity. Your Honor, the defense will demonstrate that Mr. Ortega's repair methods were developed independently and documented years before Cortec's patent filing. Miss Washington, Judge Langston interrupted, his voice slicing through the room. Focus on the relevant points. This is not a classroom. A hush fell over the gallery. Naomi's mouth tightened slightly, but she didn't flinch. Your Honor, this timeline is essential to establishing that. I said focus, Langston snapped, voice louder now. We don't need a lecture. Naomi paused, breathing in deeply. Around her, pens halted mid-stroke. Students, journalists, and junior lawyers looked up, startled. Her presentation hadn't even lasted 60 seconds. The evidence directly disproves the plaintiff's claim of patent infringement, she said, each word clipped but composed. She picked up a technical schematic, the ink still crisp on the page. This repair method was filed, time-stamped, and operational in Mr. Ortega's shop 3 years before Cortec's patent. Before she could approach the bench, Maddox rose like clockwork. Objection, Your Honor. This exhibit was not properly disclosed. Naomi turned, her voice calm but firm. Page 47, Exhibit C, submitted 2 months ago. I have the court's delivery receipt and confirmation from opposing counsel's office. Maddox faltered, but Judge Langston didn't even ask to see the document. Instead, he gave Naomi a withering glare. Miss Washington, in my courtroom, we don't argue with counsel. You will maintain decorum. I'm clarifying a factual misstatement, Naomi replied, tone unwavering. Langston leaned forward, eyes narrowing. One more word and I'll strike your exhibit. Naomi looked down at the schematic, then back up, her eyes unblinking. This wasn't her first courtroom, but it might have been the most hostile. The injustice wasn't hidden. It was loud. It was glaring. It wore a robe and sat at the bench. Yet Naomi pressed forward. She introduced the next piece of evidence, carefully linking the components, dates, and workflows that proved Ortega's independence from Cortec's technology. Each sentence was a step uphill, every pause, a calculated breath to stay centered against a current trying to pull her under. Langston interrupted her 3 more times in the next 5 minutes. Samuel Ortega sat frozen in his seat, shoulders hunched, fists clenched beneath the table. The courtroom around him blurred, the voices of attorneys and the shuffle of papers fading into a hollow, oppressive silence. He had spent the last 2 years pouring every ounce of his energy and every last cent into keeping his humble electronics repair shop alive. Now, watching the judge dismiss his lawyer's voice with condescension and barely disguised contempt, he felt something crack inside him, not from fear, from recognition. This wasn't justice. This was theater. He looked to his left. Naomi Washington remained composed, her posture straight, her jaw set, her hands steady as she flipped to the next page of her file. Not a flicker of doubt passed over her face. No panic, no frustration, only cold, razor-sharp focus. It was the kind of calm that came from years of fighting uphill battles in courtrooms where the rules weren't applied equally, and from knowing that any slip, any show of emotion, could be used to discredit her. "Your Honor," Naomi began again, lifting another document. "This is a sworn affidavit from the supplier who provided Mr. Ortega with the components used in his repair method in 2015, 2 years prior to Cortex's patent application." Judge Langston didn't even look up. "Noted. Move on." She did, unflinching, controlled. Each sentence she delivered was clear, fact-based, and relevant. But the courtroom's energy was suffocating. Naomi wasn't just arguing a case. She was surviving an ambush. The imbalance of power was stark. Maddox and his co-counsels lounged comfortably across the aisle, occasionally whispering, smirking, knowing full well the judge wasn't scrutinizing their every word. They had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy win, and Langston's behavior had only confirmed their confidence. But Naomi wasn't rattled. She adjusted the microphone slightly and pressed forward. "This blueprint," she continued, "was submitted to the Small Business Registry along with a license application. It contains the exact repair layout Cortex claims to have invented, dated well before their patent filing." She stepped forward, hand outstretched with the exhibit. Langston waved her off without glancing up. "Summarize it. We don't have time for minutia." Naomi held her ground. "The details are not minutia, Your Honor. They are the evidence." Langston's head lifted slowly. A pause stretched like a wire pulled taut. "Do not speak back to the bench, Miss Washington," he said, voice low and icy. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. Even the court reporter hesitated, fingers hovering above the stenograph machine. Samuel leaned toward Naomi, voice barely a whisper. "They're not listening. It doesn't matter what we show them, does it?" Naomi didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the judge. "It matters," she said under her breath, steady as ever. "It matters because it's true." Then louder, "Your Honor, if I may continue." Langston didn't reply. He simply gestured for her to go on, face unreadable, detached. Naomi turned back to the gallery screen, loading up an enlarged digital image of the repair schematic. "This diagram," she said, pointer in hand, "shows the functional differences between Mr. Ortega's original circuit routing and the one presented by Cortex in their patent. Our expert witness, Dr. Lena Murray, will confirm that the designs are not only independently developed, but functionally distinct." And yet again, Maddox stood. "Objection. This witness wasn't disclosed in the preliminary filings." Before Naomi could respond, Langston cut her off. "We'll determine admissibility later. Sit down, Miss Washington." She did so, calmly, with grace, but fire still burned beneath the surface. Samuel watched her in awe. He had seen lawyers break under far less. He had watched attorneys shrink when judges turned hostile. But Naomi, she absorbed every blow and turned it into fuel. Her calm wasn't submission. It was defiance honed to surgical precision. She wasn't just defending him. She was showing him what it meant to stand when the system tried to make you kneel. In the back row of courtroom 3A, a cluster of law students sat hunched over their notebooks, pens scratching across the pages with urgency. Their professor had encouraged them to observe real-world litigation to better understand courtroom dynamics, but none of them had expected to witness something like this. What was unfolding before them wasn't a trial. It was a slow-motion collision between power and principle, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Why is he treating her like that?" one student whispered, barely moving her lips. "I know, right?" another murmured, eyes flicking between the bench and the defense table. He didn't say a word when the other guy talked for like 20 minutes straight. Their attention was locked on Judge Langston, whose clipped tone and constant interruptions had turned Naomi Washington's defense into a battlefield. Every time she tried to present evidence, he cut her off. Every time she clarified a procedural point, he reprimanded her. The pattern was undeniable, and the students were starting to see it for what it was. "This doesn't feel right," someone muttered. "She's literally quoting case law and he's acting like she's wasting time." They had all learned about judicial neutrality in class. They had studied due process, the right to be heard, the sacred structure of fairness that was supposed to govern every American courtroom. But what they saw now defied that ideal. The judge's gavel wasn't maintaining order, it was controlling the narrative. And Naomi Washington was being boxed in, cut down, and pushed aside with a cold efficiency that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Then came the moment that shifted the energy completely. One of the students leaned toward the others, brow furrowed. "Wait, Naomi Washington? That name sounds familiar." There was a pause as the others looked up, curious. "Yeah," someone replied, lowering their pen. "Where have I heard that before?" Another student, flipping quickly through their tablet, typed with shaking fingers. Seconds later, his eyes widened. "Guys," he whispered, his voice suddenly low and electric. "She's the president of the Texas Bar Association." A sharp breath caught in the throat of the girl next to him. "What? Are you serious?" He turned the screen toward them. There on the front page of a legal publication was a professional headshot of Naomi Washington, standing at a podium, mid-speech, her hand raised in emphasis, her eyes fierce and focused. The headline read, "Breaking Barriers, Naomi Washington elected youngest black president in state bar history." The students looked up again, stunned. "She's not just some attorney," someone whispered. "She's her." Silence settled among them like a cold wind. Now every interruption, every dismissive wave of Judge Langston's hand, every time he cut her off or dismissed her argument, it all carried a deeper sting. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was a public dismantling of someone who had spent her career fighting to uplift others. And it wasn't subtle. The students were seeing it in real time, how even the most accomplished black woman in the room was being treated like she didn't belong there. One of the students, a first-generation law candidate, clenched her jaw and looked at Naomi with something like awe. "She's still standing," she whispered. "He's throwing everything at her, and she hasn't flinched once." Another nodded slowly. "That's not weakness. That's power." Naomi, at the center of it all, remained calm. Her voice, though interrupted, never lost its composure. Her hands didn't shake. Her logic remained airtight. But now more than a few people in the room were watching her differently. They weren't just observing a case. They were witnessing history trying to repeat itself, and a woman refusing to let it. Even from the back row, the students could feel it. Naomi Washington wasn't just defending a client. She was teaching everyone in that courtroom, especially the ones who would go on to wear robes of their own, exactly what it meant to fight with truth, dignity, and unbreakable resolve. But while the courtroom simmered with tension and silent outrage, something unexpected was happening just outside. Something that would soon flip the power dynamic on its head. Court clerk Marcus Holloway sat at his desk near the clerk's office, eyes scanning the pages of the Texas Legal Bulletin, barely paying attention at first. His morning had been spent rushing documents to judges, confirming case files, and listening to the muffled, relentless gavel strikes echoing from courtroom 3A. He had noticed Naomi Washington enter earlier, flustered but composed, and he had seen how quickly Judge Langston had turned the atmosphere from formal to hostile. He didn't know Naomi personally, but something about the way she carried herself, even under fire, lingered in his mind like a question left unanswered. And then his eyes landed on the front page of the bulletin. Naomi Washington elected first black woman, president of the Texas Bar Association. Marcus blinked. A chill ran up his spine as he stared at the photo. It was her, no doubt about it. Naomi Washington, Harvard law graduate, civil rights powerhouse, pro bono warrior. Her portrait, dignified and fearless, stared back at him from beneath the headline. She stood behind a podium, hands mid-gesture, delivering what the article called a landmark keynote on judicial accountability. The irony struck him like a slap. He quickly read through the first few paragraphs. It was more than just a ceremonial title. Naomi had spent 2 decades fighting for systemic legal reform. She'd launched clinics for underserved neighborhoods, defended hundreds of indigent clients, written 2 best-selling books on justice reform, and most recently, turned down a nomination for federal judgeship. Not because she wasn't qualified, because she believed her work at the community level still wasn't finished. Marcus swallowed hard. The woman Judge Langston had fined and humiliated in open court for arriving 7 minutes late, without even letting her speak, was arguably the most respected legal mind in the entire state, and no one in that courtroom seemed to realize it. Until now. Marcus stood abruptly, the bulletin clutched in his hand, heart racing. The air around him seemed to still. Every second that passed now felt loaded with consequence. He wasn't supposed to interrupt proceedings. Protocol dictated that he remain neutral, procedural. But what he held in his hand wasn't just a news article. It was the truth, a truth Judge Langston needed to face before the next gavel fell. He waited until the court recessed for lunch. Inside Chamber Room 3, Judge Langston sat alone at his desk, slowly stirring a cup of lukewarm coffee. His brow furrowed as he reviewed case notes, but his mind wasn't on the evidence. It was on Naomi Washington, her presence, her poise, and though he wouldn't yet admit it, the growing realization that his courtroom hadn't been in control that morning. It had been on the edge. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Marcus stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. In his hand was the folded Texas Legal Bulletin, marked with a yellow post-it tab. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, walking toward the desk. "I think you should see this." Langston raised an eyebrow. "I'm reviewing the file." While Naomi sat alone on the cold wooden bench lining the courthouse hallway, her back straight, shoulders squared, and eyes locked on the documents spread neatly across her lap. The distant hum of vending machines and muffled footsteps echoed through the tiled corridor, but she was focused, utterly, intensely focused. She reviewed technical schematics, scanned through timestamps, cross-referenced affidavits. Her pen moved in deliberate strokes as she annotated margins with notes only she could decipher. To the casual observer, she was calm, collected, in control. But beneath that professional armor, a storm churned. Her jaw tightened every time she replayed the morning in her head. Judge Langston's glare, the interruptions, the public humiliation. 7 minutes late. 7 minutes. That's all it had taken for the court to treat her like a child instead of a seasoned professional. And not once had she been allowed to explain. Not once had the judge paused to ask why. He hadn't cared. None of them had. The corporate attorneys, seated with smug indifference, had smiled as the judge silenced her again and again. Her client, Mr. Ortega, sat stunned, watching the person he'd entrusted with his livelihood be treated like an intruder in her own field. And the courtroom, the place that was supposed to uphold fairness, justice, truth, had offered no protection. Still, Naomi didn't crumble. She couldn't afford to. She had learned long ago that courtrooms weren't built for people like her. Not really. And when the rules bent, they never bent in her favor. So she had become the exception. The storm in a tailored suit. The woman who walked into biased spaces and dared to speak anyway. Now, as she sat beneath the flickering light overhead, flipping to her closing points, she had no idea what was happening behind the courtroom doors. No idea that her name had been on the cover of that morning's Texas Legal Bulletin. No idea that a court clerk had just delivered it to the judge. No idea that her legacy, her decades of work, her sacrifices, her silence turned into power, was now staring Judge Langston in the face. All Naomi knew was this. She was walking back into that courtroom, and she would finish what she started. Even if the system stood against her, even if her voice was the only one demanding to be heard. Because justice wasn't just something she believed in. It was something she embodied, quietly, fiercely, relentlessly. And as the clock above the hallway ticked closer to 1:30 p.m., Naomi gathered her papers, stood tall, and walked toward those courtroom doors. still unaware that the balance of power was about to shift. In a courtroom, Judge Victor Langston stared at the article in front of him, motionless, the edges of the bulletin trembling slightly in his hand. The sunlight that had spilled gently through his chamber window moments ago now felt cold, distant, even accusatory. The bold headlines stared back at him like a judgment rendered from a higher bench. Naomi Washington, elected first black woman, president of the Texas Bar Association. He read it once, then again. Each sentence landed with the weight of a gavel, delivering blows not to his courtroom, but to his conscience. Harvard Law, class of 2002, top of her class, a trailblazer, hundreds of pro bono cases, founder of a statewide legal aid network, two-time nominee for a federal judgeship, declined both times. Not because she wasn't qualified, but because she believed real justice didn't live in marble buildings. It lived in the streets, in shelters, in clinics, in courtrooms like his. And he had reduced her to a punchline, a warning, an example of what happens when someone dares to walk in late. 7 minutes. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, feeling something heavy slide through his chest. This wasn't just a bad call. This wasn't a tough but fair moment of discipline. No, this had been something else entirely. And now, with the truth of who she was lying bare before him, he could no longer deny it. He hadn't judged Naomi Washington by her merits. He judged her by her presence, by the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, by the way she had walked into his courtroom with confidence, by the color of her skin and the sharpness of her mind. He hadn't seen her as a colleague. He'd seen her as a disruption. The realization settled into his bones like a sickness. He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, the bulletin still clutched in his hand. Outside, the courthouse square buzzed with life. Clerks returning from lunch, attorneys on their phones, law students in clusters, discussing the morning's trial with low voices and furrowed brows. And there, on a distant bench, sat Naomi Washington, alone, her posture straight, her attention fixed on a stack of papers in her lap, reviewing, preparing, focused, still unaware of what he now knew. Langston turned away from the glass. His hands, once steady and practiced from years on the bench, now trembled slightly as he reached for the leather-bound notebook on the corner of his desk, his private journal. He had kept it since his first year as a judge, an exercise in discipline, reflection, and occasionally penance. He opened to a blank page. The pen hovered for a moment before touching paper. March 27th, 1:07 p.m. Today I saw myself clearly, and I did not like what I saw. I treated Naomi Washington with disrespect. I silenced her. I undermined her. Not because she lacked professionalism or preparation, but because of a bias I didn't want to believe I had. I didn't judge her by law. I judged her by something else. I did not judge through law. I judged through unconscious bias. The words bled from his pen like confession. He remembered her voice, steady despite his interruptions, her calm when he dismissed her documentation, her dignity when he waved off her logic like it was an inconvenience. She had not raised her voice. She hadn't stormed out. She hadn't cracked. And still he had treated her like she didn't belong, because deep down, some part of him had believed that. He closed the journal and sat back down at his desk, gripping the arms of his chair. For years, he had prided himself on being strict but fair, efficient, unshakable. But now that same pride felt brittle, false. It wasn't justice he had enforced. It was control. Judge Langston reached for the phone on his desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the intercom button. His throat felt dry, like something heavy had lodged there ever since he read Naomi Washington's name on the cover of that bulletin. He had made hundreds of rulings in his career, thousands. But this one, this moment, felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible. "Susan," he said, voice low but deliberate. "Yes, Your Honor," came the reply through the speaker. "I need two things," he said, staring out the window as Naomi sat alone in the courtyard below, still reviewing her documents with the calm of someone who had weathered storms no one else could see. "First, cancel the contempt fine issued this morning against Miss Naomi Washington, effective immediately. Make sure the paperwork reflects that it was revoked by the bench prior to payment. A pause, then. Understood, Your Honor. And second, he added, his voice tightening, I need a formal statement prepared for the court record. I'll be reading it aloud at the beginning of the afternoon session. Make sure the court reporter is ready. Every word must go on record. Susan hesitated. Would you like me to draft the apology for review? No, Langston said, shaking his head slowly. This one has to come from me. He ended the call and let the silence of his chambers settle over him like a thick fog. The gavel on his desk, polished and weighty, suddenly felt like a relic of arrogance rather than authority. That morning he had used it not to uphold justice, but to suppress it, to silence a woman who had given her life to the very system he claimed to serve. He had weaponized procedure to diminish principle, and now he would answer for it. He opened a blank page on his yellow legal pad and began to write. No legalese, no evasion, no performance. Just truth. He would name what he did. He would say it plainly, not because it absolved him, but because the courtroom deserved to hear it. She deserved to hear it. Downstairs, the hallways buzzed as lawyers returned from lunch, unaware of what was coming. But up in his chambers, Judge Langston wrote slowly, deliberately, aware that each word was more than an apology. It was the beginning of making things right. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The clock struck 1:30 p.m. and the doors to courtroom 3A creaked open once more. But this time, the energy inside was entirely different. The morning's sharp-edged tension had not disappeared. It had evolved, matured into something volatile and electric. Word had spread like wildfire throughout the courthouse. Judge Langston was going to address the courtroom personally, and not just with legal instructions, with something different. Clerks lingered at the back. Law students returned with friends in tow. Even attorneys from unrelated cases found excuses to squeeze in, hoping to witness what many whispered might be the most unprecedented moment of Judge Langston's career. Naomi Washington entered without hesitation. Her gait remained calm, unbothered, dignified. But even she could feel the shift in the air. Something had changed, though she didn't yet know what. She took her place at the defense table beside Mr. Ortega, who leaned toward her, whispering, "Everyone's watching you." Naomi didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. The bailiff stood tall and called out, "All rise." And then he appeared. Judge Victor Langston stepped onto the bench not with the self-assured posture he had worn that morning, but with something far rarer, gravity. His face was unreadable, but his movements were slower, more deliberate. He didn't immediately reach for the gavel. Instead, he removed his reading glasses and set them down gently. Then he looked directly, unflinchingly, at Naomi Washington. The room went silent. "Before we continue," Langston began, his voice low but echoing with clarity, "I have something I need to say." Naomi's eyes narrowed just slightly. Her back straightened. She hadn't expected this. Langston took a breath. "This morning," he continued, "I spoke to Miss Washington in a manner that was unprofessional, dismissive, and, most importantly, unjust." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. "I interrupted her multiple times. I dismissed her statements before they were even fully spoken. I questioned her integrity, and I issued a contempt fine without allowing her a fair opportunity to explain herself." He paused, his gaze never breaking from hers. "I was wrong." The words landed like thunder. Not a sound stirred. "I judged not by the law," he said, his voice growing heavier, "but by something much more insidious. I allowed unconscious bias to influence my behavior. That is not justice. That is not fairness. And it is certainly not the standard this courtroom, or any courtroom, should uphold." Naomi blinked, stunned. She had faced years of obstacles, of quiet indignities and overt slights, but never had she seen a judge stand up and name it, out loud, on the record. "I am hereby rescinding the contempt citation and eliminating the associated fine in full," Langston declared. "Furthermore, I am entering this apology, every word of it, into the official court record." People began to shift in their seats, unsure if they were witnessing history or some kind of legal hallucination. Langston wasn't finished. "Miss Washington," he said, and this time there was a crack in his voice. Not weakness, but the weight of truth. "You demonstrated professionalism and composure in the face of disrespect. And for that, you've earned more than my apology. You've earned my respect." For a long moment, silence gripped courtroom 3A like a steel vice. The judge's words still hung in the air, unexpected, raw, and echoing with something rarely heard from the bench: humility. Naomi Washington stood motionless behind the defense table, the soft rustle of her papers the only sound in the room. All eyes were on her now, not with skepticism, not with condescension, but with something closer to reverence. Then slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. Her expression was calm, composed, her back impossibly straight. The same composure she had worn all morning, as she endured interruption after interruption. The same quiet fire she carried through every gavel strike meant to silence her. But now, as she stood in front of a courtroom full of stunned observers and a humbled judge, there was something else in her gaze, something higher. Grace. She looked directly at Judge Langston, not with bitterness, but with the clear, piercing eyes of someone who had seen injustice and chosen not to become it. "I accept your apology, Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth and steady, each word laced with power. "But this moment, this reckoning, is not just about me." The silence in the room deepened. No one moved. She stepped slightly forward, not to command the space, but to speak into it, like she was filling a void that had gone unacknowledged for far too long. "It's about something bigger than a missed minute, or a gavel strike, or a single courtroom," she continued. "It's about how we listen, who we choose to listen to, and how the pursuit of justice can so easily become a weapon. When we forget that behind every case file, every argument, every late arrival is a human being." Her words didn't rise in volume, but their weight intensified with every syllable. "I've been in courtrooms across this state. I've defended people who had no voice. I've stood before judges who never once looked me in the eye. And I've won, not because the system made it easy, but because I refused to let it break me." Naomi paused. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the defense table. The room was still. The gallery, packed with students, clerks, and attorneys, hung on her every word. "And today I'm reminded of something I say often to my students, to my mentees, to the young lawyers who think they have to shout to be heard." She looked around the room, then back at the bench. "Justice must learn to listen." The sentence hit like a bolt of lightning, sharp, clear, impossible to ignore. Even Judge Langston bowed his head for a breath, as if the words struck a place in him deeper than guilt. They struck a place called truth. For a few seconds, the room held its breath. Then, from the back row, a single clap, software, isolated, hesitant, then another, and another, until a gentle wave of applause rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't rowdy, it wasn't theatrical. It was restrained, reverent, like a collective exhale from everyone who had felt the imbalance of the morning and now finally saw it being set right. Naomi didn't bask in it. She simply nodded once, then quietly sat down, her presence still commanding, her grace unquestioned. Judge Langston cleared his throat, visibly moved, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. His power had already shifted, not taken but returned to its rightful balance. In the gallery, a young law student wiped tears from her eyes. A clerk leaned closer to a colleague and whispered, "That's how you change a courtroom." Even the corporate attorneys at the plaintiff's table looked uncomfortable now, shrinking into their seats under the weight of their earlier smirks. And still, Naomi sat quietly, because she didn't need vindication. She was the vindication, not through fury, through restraint, not through accusation, through truth. Courtroom 3A would never be the same, not because a judge admitted he was wrong, but because a woman who had every reason to burn the place down chose instead to rebuild it with words that couldn't be cross-examined. Justice must learn to listen, and in that room on that day it finally did. The courthouse corridors buzzed long after the gavel had fallen. Word of the afternoon's unprecedented events had spread beyond courtroom 3A. Past the law clerks, the bailiffs, the court reporters, people whispered Naomi Washington's name with a reverence once reserved for legends. But while others speculated, Naomi remained focused, calm, and composed, unmoved by the attention. She had walked into that courtroom for one reason: to defend her client. The rest had simply been truth demanding to be heard. Judge Langston found her near the west stairwell, her case files tucked neatly under her arm, ready to leave. For a man who had built a career on authority, control, and distance, he now looked deeply human, shoulders heavy, expression earnest. He cleared his throat softly before speaking, his voice quieter than it had been all day. "Miss Washington," he began, "do you have a moment?" She turned to face him, her expression neutral, unreadable. "I wanted to say, off the record, thank you," he said, "not just for your professionalism today, but for your words. They struck deeper than I expected." Naomi gave a slow nod. "Sometimes the truth has a way of doing that." He managed a small smile, one that faded quickly into something more serious. "I've spent years thinking I ran a fair courtroom, but today I saw how blind I've been, how easy it is to believe you're impartial when you've never had to prove yourself the way others do." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "I want to do more than just apologize. I want to change how we do things here, and I need your help." Naomi studied him in silence. There was no triumph in her eyes, only calculation. She had heard promises before, hollow ones, apologies that never left the hallway. She wasn't moved by intentions. She was moved by action. "I appreciate the offer, Your Honor," she replied. "But if this is going to be a press release, a checklist training, or some empty DEI seminar, then I'm not interested." Langston blinked. Naomi stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "If we're going to fix this system, it can't be cosmetic. We need to tear into the roots, review judicial conduct, create real accountability, bring in people from the outside, not just the same names passed around in legal circles." She wasn't negotiating. She was drawing a line. "If you're serious," she continued, "we'll build something together. But it has to be real. No more performative justice. No more silence disguised as professionalism." Langston nodded slowly. "I'm serious." "Good," she said. "Then let's get to work." And just like that, the courtroom battle became a movement. Not with banners or chants, but with policy drafts and late-night meetings. The judge who once silenced her was now the one listening. And the woman he tried to diminish became the architect of reform. Because Naomi Washington didn't just walk into a courtroom that day, she walked out with the power to rebuild it. In the weeks following the explosive day in courtroom 3A, Naomi Washington and Judge Victor Langston began quietly laying the groundwork for reform. The corridors of the courthouse became their meeting rooms. Dimly lit chambers became war rooms where old biases met fresh perspectives head-on. Naomi's insistence on action, not symbolism, transformed Langston's vague promises into a battle plan with concrete targets. They understood clearly what they were up against: a justice system entrenched in tradition, resistant to scrutiny, and hostile to change. Their first project was ambitious: comprehensive anti-bias training for every courthouse employee, from judges and bailiffs to clerks and administrative staff. Naomi insisted on bringing in experts, psychologists, historians, racial justice scholars, people who could dissect not just legal procedure, but the invisible biases that lurk behind every ruling. The training sessions were intense, uncomfortable, and revealing. Voices trembled as veteran court officers confronted deeply rooted prejudices for the first time in their careers. Langston himself attended every session, sitting quietly at the back, his presence an unspoken acknowledgement of his past failures and future commitment. But Naomi knew awareness alone wasn't enough. She was determined to shift the culture at a structural level, to dismantle the invisible walls that had almost silenced her that day in court. She proposed a mentorship program aimed explicitly at law students and young attorneys from marginalized communities, those who traditionally lacked connections, resources, or role models in the legal profession. The courthouse quickly became a space of learning and empowerment. Naomi personally mentored dozens of young lawyers, guiding them through the challenges she herself had faced. Her mentees learned not only how to argue a case, but how to hold their ground when the system pushed back. Langston watched with a mixture of respect and quiet shame as Naomi and her growing team of protégés brought fresh energy into previously sterile hallways. These young advocates weren't just gaining legal skills, they were reclaiming spaces from which their voices had historically been excluded. The courthouse felt different now, more alive, charged with possibility. As the mentorship program took root, Naomi and Langston introduced another critical innovation: an anonymous community feedback system. For the first time, members of the public had a safe channel to speak honestly about their courtroom experiences. Within days, stories poured in, testimonies from people who'd felt humiliated, ignored, or mistreated in courtrooms throughout the county. Naomi read each account, her heart tightening at familiar echoes of her own experience. Yet she turned this anger into fuel, channeling it into action. Every piece of feedback became evidence, and every story of injustice reinforced the urgency of their work. In parallel, Naomi pushed to dramatically expand the courthouse's pro bono legal aid program, determined that no person in their community should lose a case simply because they lacked resources. She organized workshops, raised funds, rallied support from local law firms, and swiftly built a coalition of attorneys eager to donate their time. Dozens of previously hopeless cases found powerful representation, reversing evictions, correcting wrongful arrests, and restoring dignity where the system had failed. Months passed, and skepticism gave way to tangible results. A quiet revolution was underway, fueled not by slogans or speeches, but by the steady, relentless force of reform. The impact of Naomi's leadership became undeniable. Courthouse statistics began to shift dramatically. Complaints of biased treatment dropped sharply. Community members felt heard, respected, and safe in a courtroom environment once seen as hostile territory. Young minority attorneys, previously unsure of their place in the legal community, stood confidently before judges who now viewed them not with suspicion, but with respect. One afternoon, Naomi stood at the courthouse entrance, gazing across the busy lobby. She watched as a young black law student, one of her mentees, confidently approached a judge to ask a question. The exchange was warm, respectful, and genuine, a simple interaction that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "You changed all of this," a voice said quietly beside her. Naomi turned to see Judge Langston standing there, eyes filled with quiet admiration. "No," Naomi replied calmly, meeting his gaze. "We changed this because we finally listened." Langston nodded, acknowledging the hard-earned wisdom in her words. They had built something remarkable together, a framework for genuine justice, not one rooted in empty promises or symbolic gestures, but anchored deeply in fairness, empathy, and respect. Yet Naomi knew their work wasn't done. She recognized the relentless persistence of injustice. Bias, she understood, would always lurk beneath the surface, waiting patiently to reclaim lost ground. She wasn't naive enough to believe they'd solved everything, but she had seen the power of action over words, of truth over convenience. As evening sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating the marble walls with a soft glow, Naomi felt a quiet surge of pride, not in personal triumph, but in collective possibility. She had entered this courthouse under fire, silenced by prejudice, doubted by those in power. Now, months later, she stood shoulder to shoulder with the man who had once embodied everything wrong with the system, both committed to dismantling the very structures that had failed so many. Together, they had proven that justice wasn't just a theory, it was a practice. It was listening. It was doing better every day without compromise. Exactly 1 year after that unforgettable day in courtroom 3A, Naomi once again stood before an audience. But this time, instead of facing skepticism, hostility, and prejudice, she stood beneath the towering arches of the Texas State Convention Center, a vast auditorium filled to capacity with judges, attorneys, legal scholars, community leaders, and aspiring young advocates from across the state. The conference, aptly named the Fair Justice Summit, was the culmination of months of relentless dedication and transformative reform. As Naomi approached the podium, a powerful hush fell over the audience, an electric anticipation weaving through the silence. Camera lights flickered from news crews lining the walls, eager to document the historic moment unfolding before them. Naomi briefly scanned the sea of faces before her. Hundreds of men and women gathered not just to talk, but to listen. In the front row sat Judge Victor Langston, his expression calm and respectful. For a brief moment, their eyes met, sharing an unspoken acknowledgement of how far they'd both come since that fateful encounter. Naomi took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of determination that had propelled her through countless battles. Memories flashed vividly through her mind, the contempt fine, the interruptions, the icy disdain of that day, and the crushing injustice she'd faced. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, then began speaking in a clear, powerful voice. 1 year ago, I stood in a courtroom that wasn't ready to hear me, not because I lacked competence, preparation, or evidence, but because unconscious bias had deafened it. The room tightened with intensity, her words ringing out sharply. Naomi continued, "But today we gather here as living proof that systems can learn, people can change, and justice, real justice, is never static, but always evolving." As she spoke, a large screen behind her illuminated with powerful images, courtroom trainings, mentoring sessions, anonymous community feedback boxes overflowing with handwritten notes, and teams of lawyers volunteering late into the night. Together with Judge Langston and many dedicated colleagues present here today, we have transformed promises into action, not mere symbolic gestures, but profound structural reform. Naomi raised her hand toward the screen, now showing faces of courthouse staff, bailiffs, clerks, judges, participating in intense anti-bias training workshops. Every member of our judicial system in these courthouses participated in rigorous training designed to confront uncomfortable truths. And because courage is not the absence of discomfort, but the choice to act despite it, we now stand here today with tangible results. A bold graph appeared on screen, the dramatic downward curve unmistakable. Reports of discriminatory treatment across 23 courthouses statewide have decreased by over 70%. 70% fewer people now leave our courts feeling diminished or unheard. An audible gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by an enthusiastic burst of applause. Naomi paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to resonate deeply. "But perhaps our greatest achievement goes beyond statistics," she resumed, voice steady yet deeply passionate. "Today, dozens of young attorneys from diverse backgrounds, lawyers who once felt sidelined or silenced, now approach the bench with confidence, assured that their voices, their arguments, their dignity will no longer be undermined." The screen now showed young lawyers in vibrant dialogue with senior judges, their expressions bright with newfound confidence. "One young woman told me recently," Naomi shared with genuine emotion, "that for the first time, she argued a case without fearing how she'd be judged. Not on her skills or argument, but on her gender, her race, or the background from which she came." The audience sat in profound silence, absorbing every word. Naomi pressed on, her voice filled with quiet intensity. "Justice is not an abstract principle. It is the daily practice of fairness and respect. It is listening, truly listening, to voices we have long overlooked." She glanced again toward Langston, whose eyes now glistened with quiet pride. Naomi's expression softened as she pointed to a familiar face on screen, James Ortega, her former client, now smiling brightly as he stood beside a community legal aid booth. James Ortega once faced ruin because the system chose not to listen. Today, he volunteers tirelessly in our expanded community legal aid program, ensuring that no one else experiences what he endured. The audience erupted into heartfelt applause as James stood briefly from his seat in the middle of the crowd, smiling modestly as he waved. Naomi's voice grew stronger, her conviction unwavering. "We have built anonymous channels to receive honest community feedback, where previously silenced experiences now shape our policies directly. Because justice, genuine justice, thrives on accountability and transparency." She paused deliberately, the entire room holding its breath. "Yet our work is far from complete. Bias and injustice are resilient foes, waiting patiently, quietly, to reclaim lost ground. But we will remain vigilant. Naomi's voice rose, clear and commanding. We have proven that justice can evolve, not through empty promises or easy slogans, but through meaningful, courageous action. We've demonstrated that fairness can flourish in spaces once hostile through the simple yet revolutionary act of listening. As she approached the close of her address, the entire audience was captivated. Naomi leaned slightly forward, speaking softly, yet with compelling power. True justice isn't found merely in verdicts of guilty or innocent, nor in who wins or loses a case. True justice emerges from our willingness to listen, learn, and most importantly, change. She paused briefly, the weight of her message echoing powerfully. Let today be a clear reminder. Justice is not static. It demands action, empathy, and courage. It demands accountability. And above all, it demands the humility to admit when we have failed. She took a deep breath, eyes briefly closing as she gathered her final words. When she opened them again, her gaze pierced through every heart in the auditorium. Justice is never fully achieved in a single ruling or a solitary speech. It is the quiet yet unyielding pursuit of a fairer system for everyone who walks through our courthouse doors. It is a call we must answer each day, with each interaction, in every courtroom. Naomi stepped back from the podium, and for a heartbeat, absolute silence filled the vast space. Then slowly, one by one, the audience rose. First Judge Langston, then James Ortega, followed by hundreds of judges, lawyers, students, and community leaders, until the entire auditorium stood in a unified, powerful ovation. Naomi, dignified and humble, nodded appreciatively, her eyes sparkling with quiet determination. As applause resonated throughout the auditorium, it was clear to all present that they were not simply applauding a woman who'd overcome incredible adversity. They were celebrating a transformation long overdue, a seismic shift that Naomi had ignited, a movement redefining justice itself. As Naomi left the stage, the applause continued, vibrant and unrelenting. Langston approached, offering a gentle handshake and whispered words of gratitude. "You changed more than my courtroom, Naomi. You changed me." She met his gaze with grace and quiet strength. "We changed it together because we chose to listen." One bright, clear morning, sunlight spilled across the polished marble floor of the Harris County Courthouse lobby, illuminating a newly installed portrait that hung prominently on the courthouse's central wall. Lawyers, clerks, judges, and visitors stopped to look, pausing mid-stride as their eyes absorbed the powerful image before them. In the photograph, Naomi Washington and Judge Victor Langston stood side by side, their shoulders level, their gazes steady, radiating confidence, strength, and above all, mutual respect. Beneath their feet, in bold lettering, read a single profound statement: "Justice begins with courage." Those 4 words etched boldly beneath the image resonated like an unspoken declaration. Courage, the willingness to face uncomfortable truths, to challenge the comfortable familiarity of injustice, to confront one's own biases openly, had transformed the courthouse. It was courage that had reshaped courtroom after courtroom across Texas, courage that had turned adversaries into allies, and courage that now stood immortalized upon this wall. Nearby, Judge Langston stood quietly with Naomi, both reflecting silently as passers-by glanced toward them with respectful nods and subtle smiles. The courthouse felt different these days, charged with a new energy, a sense of calm yet dynamic purpose. But Langston remembered vividly how it once had been. His mind drifted back to that morning years ago, when he had silenced Naomi, fined her unjustly, and allowed prejudice, not justice, to steer his judgment. That day haunted him still, the sharpness of his voice, the cold indifference he'd shown her, and how swiftly he'd wielded his gavel as a weapon rather than a tool of fairness. It was a memory now softened by redemption, but never forgotten, a scar that reminded him daily of his responsibility as a guardian of justice. He sighed softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "You know, Naomi," Langston began quietly, his voice gentle yet firm, tinged with quiet reflection. "Of all the changes we've implemented here, Of all the reforms we've pushed forward, I'm proudest of the fact that the young attorneys who come here today don't even know what happened back then. Naomi looked at him, her eyes thoughtful, serene, patient. For these young lawyers, fairness in the courtroom is no longer something they hope for, Langston continued. It's not something extraordinary they have to fight desperately to achieve. It's just normal, expected, taken for granted. He turned slowly, watching as a group of newly minted attorneys entered the lobby. Bright-eyed, confident, unburdened by the shadows of the past, they moved freely through the courthouse doors, greeting colleagues, preparing for the day's trials. Langston felt his chest swell with quiet pride and deep humility. They step into this courtroom knowing they'll be heard, that they'll be judged solely on their merits. And that, he paused, his voice thickening slightly with emotion, that's the legacy you and I built. Naomi smiled softly, her gaze unwavering as she turned toward him. You're right, Victor, she replied gently. But remember, true change isn't just about forgetting the struggles. It's about reaching a point where no one has to face those struggles at all, where justice is so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the system that fairness isn't remarkable. It's simply the standard. She paused, her words lingering heavily between them, each syllable charged with powerful conviction. Real progress, Naomi continued, her voice rising just slightly, is when no lawyer, no defendant, no client ever again has to beg for basic dignity, when no one has to stand alone, silenced by the prejudice of those in power. Langston nodded solemnly. Naomi's words resonated deeply. They were a reminder that, despite their progress, the pursuit of justice remained a constant and vigilant struggle, one that required humility, honesty, and continuous self-reflection. They stood quietly, shoulder to shoulder beneath their own image. Attorneys, clerks, and courthouse staff continued to move around them, each absorbed in their own tasks, yet unconsciously benefiting from the very courage and persistence embodied by Naomi and Langston's reforms. As the two watched in comfortable silence, James Ortega entered the lobby, now proudly wearing a badge identifying him as a senior volunteer coordinator in the Community Legal Aid Office. He moved through the lobby with quiet confidence, greeting visitors, assisting new clients, an embodiment of the profound impact Naomi and Langston's reforms had achieved. Catching sight of Naomi and Langston, James paused briefly to wave, a subtle nod of gratitude passing between them before he resumed his purposeful stride. Seeing James brought fresh clarity to Naomi's voice as she turned again to Langston. Remember him, Victor? She asked quietly. When we first met, James was nearly destroyed by a system blind to its own prejudice. But today he's leading others through that same system, transforming injustice into hope. Langston exhaled softly, his expression humbled, thoughtful. I remember, he replied quietly. His story and yours remind me daily that justice is not merely rules and laws, but people, real lives shaped by our actions. Naomi nodded, a slight powerful smile playing on her lips. Exactly. The courage we speak of isn't just bravery in the courtroom, Victor. It's the courage to challenge ourselves, to admit when we've failed, to change even when it's painful, and above all, to listen when it's uncomfortable. Langston's eyes reflected deep understanding. I've learned, he admitted slowly, that the hardest cases we face aren't on the docket. They're within us, the battles against our own biases, the assumptions we unknowingly make. That's why true justice, real justice, starts with bravery. It starts here. He gently tapped his chest, inside. They stood silently again, absorbing the gravity of their own words. Their reforms had not merely reshaped a courthouse, they had reshaped them. Together, through conflict and reconciliation, humility and strength, they had created lasting change rooted not in superficial reform, but in the transformative power of empathy and respect. Across the lobby, young attorneys gathered excitedly near a mentorship program poster, their expressions bright with optimism, unburdened by the scars of past injustices. They had inherited a courthouse where respect was standard, fairness unquestioned. Naomi turned toward Langston once more, her voice filled with quiet resolve. You're right to be proud, Victor. These young lawyers, they won't remember the day justice failed us. They'll never know the pain we faced, But more importantly, they'll never have to. Langston drew in a deep, thoughtful breath. He had always thought justice required rigid control, authority wielded with stern impartiality. But Naomi had shown him differently. Justice required humility, listening, courage, the kind he hadn't known he possessed until forced to confront his own shortcomings. Naomi, he began softly, sincerity deepening his tone, I once silenced your voice without a second thought. Yet today I listen to you, and to others, not because the rules force me, but because true justice demands it. For that lesson, his voice lowered respectfully, I'll forever be grateful. Naomi gently touched his shoulder, a quiet, dignified gesture of mutual respect. We both learned, Victor, she said softly. Justice isn't just what we deliver from the bench, it's what we demand from ourselves each day. It's courage, the courage to change, to grow, to listen. Together they stood beneath their own image, a quiet testament to the transformative power of courage, humility, and relentless pursuit of true fairness. As the courthouse bustled around them, one young law student paused beneath their photograph, quietly reading the inscription aloud to herself. Justice begins with courage. She glanced toward Naomi and Langston, recognizing them from the portrait. Their calm, confident presence radiated a strength that inspired her deeply. She nodded respectfully, receiving warm smiles from both. Unaware of past struggles, untouched by previous injustices, she moved forward, ready to practice law in a place where fairness and dignity were no longer goals to achieve, but rights assured. Naomi watched her go, pride swelling quietly within. That, she said softly to Langston, is what justice looks like. Langston smiled knowingly. Yes, he agreed. When courage becomes so natural, it no longer requires praise. That is when justice truly begins. They stood together, silent once more, hopeful and resolute beneath the portrait, a living, breathing testament that even the harshest injustices can be transformed when met with courage and humility. And in that moment, justice, real, enduring justice, felt not only possible, but profoundly, permanently alive. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.